It is just after 3 o'clock in the morning. October 26, 1984. Two long-haul truck drivers are making their way down a quiet road near the village of Hager-Seelbach, in the wooded hills of central West Germany. It is cold. A thin fog clings to the asphalt. And as their headlights sweep across an off-ramp near the A45 motorway, one of the main highways cutting through this part of the country, they see something that makes them slow down. A car, a Volkswagen Golf, is crumpled in a drainage ditch at the side of the road. The front end is smashed. The headlights are dark. Steam rises from the engine block. They pull over. They approach the wreck. And inside, they find a man. He is in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat. He is severely injured. And he is naked. His name is Günther Stoll. He is 34 years old. A food engineer by training. A husband. A man who, for years, had been telling everyone who would listen that they were out to get him. That unnamed people were following him, watching him, closing in. Everyone thought he was paranoid. Now he is dying in a ditch, and his injuries do not match the car crash. Medics arrive. They rush him to a nearby hospital. He cannot speak coherently. He will never wake up again. Günther Stoll is pronounced dead before dawn. In the hours that follow, as investigators begin to piece together his final night alive, they discover something else, something that will turn this case from a strange roadside death into one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries in German criminal history. On a scrap of paper found among his belongings, Günther Stoll had written 6 letters, just hours before he died. YOGTZE. No one knows what it means. No one has ever decoded it. And the deeper investigators look into his last night on Earth, the less anything makes sense. Because the crash didn't cause all his injuries. Because he didn't end up in the passenger seat on his own. And because the man everyone dismissed as delusional may have been telling the truth all along. To understand how Günther Stoll ended up dead on that cold October night, we need to go back to who he was, back to what he feared, and back to a sequence of events so strange that, for decades later, no one can fully explain them. This is the YOGTZE case. And this is Enter the Crime. If you're new to this channel, we tell global true crime stories like documentaries. If that's your kind of thing, consider subscribing. This one is going to stay with you. To understand this case, you first need to understand where it happened, and when. In 1984, Germany was still divided. The Berlin Wall would not fall for another 5 years. The country existed as 2 separate states, West Germany, a democratic, Western-aligned republic, and East Germany, a communist state under Soviet influence. The border between them wasn't just political. It was physical. Concrete walls. Minefields. Watchtowers. West Germany in the early 1980s was a country living under tension. The Cold War was at one of its most anxious peaks. NATO had begun deploying American Pershing II nuclear missiles on West German soil, a decision that triggered massive protests across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people marched. Fear of nuclear war was not abstract. It was on the evening news. At the same time, West Germany was still dealing with the aftershocks of left-wing terrorism. The Red Army faction, a militant group sometimes called the Baader-Meinhof Gang, had carried out bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations throughout the 1970s. Their shadow still hung over the national psyche. Intelligence agencies were active. Surveillance was aggressive. And ordinary citizens sometimes got swept into the machinery of a security state that trusted no one. Now zoom into a quieter corner of this anxious country. The Siegerland, a hilly, forested region in the southern part of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, one of the westernmost states of West Germany, bordering Belgium and the Netherlands. The Siegerland is not a major city. It is a landscape of small towns, winding roads, dense woodland, and local industry. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, where life moves slowly, and where a man saying strange things tends to get noticed. This is where Günther Stoll lived. Food engineer, or Lebensmittelingenieur in German, which in the West German economy meant someone with a technical education in food processing and production. It was a respectable qualification. But by 1984, Günther was unemployed. The West German economy, though stronger than most in Europe, had been through a painful recession in the early 80s. Unemployment had climbed sharply. In industrial and semi-rural regions like the Siegerland, jobs weren't easy to come by, especially for someone with a narrow specialization. Günther struggled to find steady work. And that struggle weighed on him. He was married to a woman named Friedel. By most accounts, theirs was a quiet domestic life, not flashy, not dramatic. They lived in Anshausen, a small district of the town of Wilnsdorf in the Siegen-Wittgenstein area. A modest home. A quiet street. The kind of life that isn't supposed to end the way Günther's did. But something was wrong with Günther. And it had been wrong for a while. 4 months, some accounts suggest even longer, Günther had been telling people that he was being watched. That unnamed individuals, he called them simply die, the German word for they, were following him, monitoring him. That something sinister was going on around him, and that these people meant him harm. He told his wife. He told friends. He told acquaintances at local pubs. Always the same thing. They were out there. They were closing in. And almost everyone who heard him say it came to the same conclusion. Günther Stoll was paranoid. Maybe it was the unemployment. Maybe it was depression. Maybe it was the low-level anxiety that seemed to pulse through West German life in the shadow of the Cold War. Whatever it was, the people around Günther did what people often do when someone makes claims they cannot verify. They dismissed him. They nodded politely. They changed the subject. Some felt sorry for him. Others simply stopped listening. This is important. Not because it tells us whether Günther was right or wrong, we'll come back to that, but because it tells us something about the world he was living in at the time of his death. He was a man who felt threatened. He was a man whose warnings were ignored. And he was a man who, on the night of October 25, 1984, suddenly seemed to have a breakthrough, or a breakdown, that set into motion the strangest and most tragic sequence of events in his life. Let me set the scene. It is the evening of October 25th, a Thursday. The autumn air is cold. Darkness comes early in the Siegerland at this time of year. Günther and Friedel are home together. It is an ordinary evening, or at least it appears to be. And then, without warning, something changes. Günther jumps up from his seat. His eyes are wide. His body language shifts, suddenly animated, suddenly urgent. He says something to Friedel, a phrase in German that translates roughly to, "Now I've got it." Or, more literally, "Now a light has gone on for me. Jetzt geht mir ein Licht auf." And then he grabs a scrap of paper. Some accounts say a napkin. Others say a small notepad, and he writes down 6 letters. He writes them quickly. Urgently, as if the thought might vanish if he doesn't capture it immediately. The apostrophe between the G and the T is there, a small, deliberate punctuation mark that suggests these letters are not random. They are structured. They mean something to him. And then, almost immediately, he crosses the word out. He scratches through it with his pen, as if correcting himself, as if deciding, in that same instant, that writing it down was a mistake. Friedel watches all of this. She asks him what it means. What is YOGTZE? What has he figured out? Günther doesn't explain. And within minutes, he leaves the house. He takes his car, a Volkswagen Golf, and drives out into the night. Friedel is left behind. Confused. But not, perhaps, entirely surprised. She has seen Günther act strangely before. She has heard him talk about them before. Maybe this is just another episode. Maybe he'll come home in an hour or 2. He won't. Because the night Günther Stoll drives away from his home is the last night of his life. And everything that happens between that moment and the moment his body is found in a roadside ditch is a sequence of events so contradictory, so layered with unanswered questions, that investigators will spend decades trying to make sense of it. And they never will. What follows, the next 5 or 6 hours of Günther Stoll's life, is a journey through the dark, with stops that raise more questions than answers, and an ending that remains, to this day, unexplained. The question is, was Günther running from something? Running towards something? Or did something find him before he could get away? To answer that, we need to follow him into the night. The crime. The exact timeline of Günther Stoll's final hours has been reconstructed from witness statements, police reports, and forensic estimates. Some details are well established. Others are contested. I'll tell you what is known, and be clear about what isn't. After leaving his home in Anshausen, Günther drives to a local pub. Some sources identify it as a Gaststätte, a traditional German inn or tavern, in the Wilnsdorf area. The kind of place where regulars gather, where the lighting is warm, where the bartender knows your name. Günther walks in. He orders a beer. And then, according to multiple witnesses, he collapses. He falls off his bar stool and hits the floor. Patrons rush over. They help him up. He appears dazed, unsteady. But here is the crucial detail. The witnesses say he does not appear drunk. He has only just arrived. He has barely touched his drink. Whatever caused him to fall, it wasn't alcohol. Was it a medical episode? A seizure? A reaction to something he consumed before arriving? Or was it something else? Fear, shock, a sudden physiological response to whatever realization he'd had just minutes earlier? No one knows. Because Günther doesn't explain. He collects himself, thanks to the people who helped him, and leaves the pub. He gets back in his car. And he drives. The next confirmed sighting of Günther comes sometime around midnight, roughly an hour or more after leaving the pub. He shows up at the home of a woman he knows. Accounts vary on the exact nature of their relationship. Some reports describe her as an old acquaintance, others as a former colleague or casual friend. She lives in a town nearby, possibly in the Hagen or Ludenscheid area, larger towns in the Westphalian region. She is surprised to see him. It is midnight. He is at her door, unannounced. What happens during this visit is not well documented. By most accounts, the interaction is brief. He doesn't stay long. He may have seemed agitated or distracted. The woman later tells police that his visit was unexpected and that he left without explaining why he had come. And then Günther Stoll disappears, into the dark, into the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. A gap of roughly 2 to 3 hours that has never been fully accounted for. Where did he go? Whom did he see? What happened in those missing hours? There are fragments. Some reports, though not all sources agree on their reliability, suggest that Günther may have been seen at a rest stop or parking area along the A45 motorway sometime during this window. And more critically, some witnesses reportedly told police that he was not alone, that he was seen in the company of several other people, as many as 4 individuals. If this is true, it changes everything, because it means Günther met with people during the night, people who have never been identified, people who have never come forward. But what we know for certain is what happens next. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, on October 26, 1984, 2 truck drivers traveling along a road near Hagerseelbach, a small village on the edge of the Landil region, just across the state border into Hesse, spot a wrecked car on an off-ramp connected to the A45 motorway. The Volkswagen Golf has left the road. It is in a ditch. The damage is significant. The front end is crumpled, the bodywork bent and twisted. It looks like a high-speed impact, though the off-ramp itself is not a place where high speeds are typical. The truck drivers approach the vehicle, and what they find inside makes no immediate sense. Günther Stoll is in the passenger seat. Not the driver's seat. The passenger seat. He is severely injured. His body shows signs of serious trauma. And he is naked, or at least largely undressed. His clothing is reportedly found inside or near the car, but it is not on his body. He is alive, barely. He appears to be semi-conscious but cannot speak coherently. The truck drivers call for help. An ambulance arrives. Günther is extracted from the wreck and rushed to a hospital. He does not survive. He dies in the early hours of October 26th, without ever regaining the ability to communicate clearly. Whatever he knew, whatever he had discovered, whatever he had written on that scrap of paper, whoever he had met in the dark, dies with him. And then the forensic examination begins. And that's when this case goes from strange to impossible. The doctors who examine Günther Stoll's body find injuries that are consistent with a car crash. Blunt force trauma. Impact wounds. Fractures. That much is expected. But they also find something else. Injuries that are not consistent with the crash. Specifically, they find impact damage to his lower legs, to his shins and the area around his knees, that shows a pattern consistent with being struck by a vehicle while standing upright. In forensic pathology, these are sometimes called bumper injuries. They occur when a car's front bumper or hood strikes a pedestrian's lower body. They look different from the injuries a person sustains while sitting inside a vehicle during a crash. The angle is different. The force distribution is different. What this means in plain language is this. At some point before the car crash, Günther Stoll was hit by a car while he was on his feet outside the vehicle. He was struck. Then he ended up in the car. Then the car crashed. And when it came to rest in that ditch, he was in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat, which raises an immediate and obvious question. If Günther was in the passenger seat, who was driving? And if someone else was driving, where did they go? Because when the truck drivers found the car, Günther Stoll was alone. But as investigators began working on the scene, and as they examined the car, the road, and the body, nothing about this case would get simpler. Because every answer only generated more questions. And every lead only seemed to pull further into the dark. The investigation. When German police, specifically investigators from the state of Hesse, since the crash site was just over the border from North Rhine-Westphalia, began examining this case, they had a basic set of facts. A man had been found dead in a wrecked car. He had injuries that predated the crash. He was in the wrong seat. He was undressed. His car was on an isolated off-ramp in the middle of the night. And on a piece of paper in his possession, he had written 6 letters that no one could explain. The initial question was simple. Was this an accident, a suicide, or something else? The accident theory was the first to be considered, and the first to develop serious problems. Yes, the car had crashed. But the pre-crash injuries, the impact marks on Günther's legs, could not be explained by the crash itself. If he had simply lost control of his vehicle and gone off the road, those injuries should not exist. They pointed to a separate incident, a hit and run, or a deliberate act of violence that occurred before the crash. Moreover, the fact that he was in the passenger seat was extremely difficult to reconcile with a solo driving accident. If he had been driving and the car had crashed, even accounting for the chaos of a collision, the physics of impact tend to keep a driver on the driver's side. People do not typically migrate across the cabin of a car during a crash. The suicide theory was also difficult to sustain. While Günther had been reported as depressed and anxious, his behavior that evening did not follow a pattern typically associated with self-harm. He had visited a pub. He had visited an acquaintance. He appeared to be going somewhere with purpose. And the manner of his death, the pre-crash injuries, the undressing, the wrong seat, didn't align with any recognized method of self-inflicted harm, which left the third possibility, that someone else had been involved. Pattern interrupt, investigative pivot. Detectives began reconstructing Günther's final night. They spoke to Friedel, who described the YOGTZE moment, the sudden exclamation, the scribbled note, the crossing out. They spoke to the pub patrons, who described his collapse. They spoke to the woman he visited at midnight, who described his brief, unexplained appearance at her door. They spoke to the truck drivers, who described finding him in the wreck. And each interview raised new questions rather than answering old ones. Why had Günther collapsed at the pub? Was it stress? A medical condition? Was he drugged? Toxicology results from the autopsy, at least as reported in available sources, did not conclusively identify any poison or incapacitating substance, though it should be noted that forensic toxicology in 1984 was far less sensitive than modern testing. Many substances that could cause a sudden collapse might not have been detected with the technology available at the time. Why had he visited the woman at midnight? What was the purpose of the visit? She reportedly told police she didn't know why he came. But was there more to their connection than appeared on the surface? Investigators explored this thread but, from what is publicly known, did not find evidence of a romantic involvement or a clandestine relationship that would explain the late-night visit. And then there was the biggest gap of all, the missing hours. From roughly midnight, when Günther left the acquaintance's home, to approximately 3 in the morning when the truck drivers found his car, what happened during those 2 to 3 hours? Here, the investigation hit a wall, and also generated its most tantalizing lead. Some witness accounts, as previously mentioned, reportedly placed Günther at a rest area or parking location along or near the A45 motorway during the early hours of October 26. More importantly, some of these accounts reportedly described him in the company of other individuals, possibly as many as 4 people. If accurate, this is extraordinary. It would mean that Günther met with a group of people in the dead of night, just hours before his death. These people were never identified. They never came forward. And no one has ever been able to confirm who they were or what business Günther had with them. Were these they Günther had been talking about? Were they people he feared, or people he was cooperating with? Were they involved in his death, or witnesses to something that happened before it? The investigation could not answer these questions. And this is where we need to pause and talk about something important, the limitations of this particular investigation. The YOGTZE case fell into a kind of jurisdictional and classificatory gray zone. The crash occurred in Hesse, but Günther lived in North Rhine-Westphalia. His movements on the night in question spanned both states. In the West German system of the 1980s, criminal investigations were primarily handled by state-level police, the Landespolizei, with federal involvement only in specific circumstances. Coordinating across state lines was not always seamless. More fundamentally, there was a question about what kind of case this was. An accident? A suspicious death? A homicide? The classification mattered, because it determined how many resources were allocated, how aggressively leads were pursued, and how long the investigation stayed active. From what is publicly known, investigators did take the case seriously. They examined the vehicle for evidence. They looked for paint transfer or damage patterns that might indicate a collision with another vehicle. They analyzed the roadway. They canvassed for witnesses along the A45 corridor. But this was 1984. There were no mobile phone records to trace. No GPS data. No CCTV cameras on rural motorway off-ramps. No DNA profiling. The technique would not be applied to criminal casework until 1986, 2 years later. The tools that modern investigators rely on simply did not exist. And the physical evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive enough to point to a specific suspect or group. There was no murder weapon. There were no identified fingerprints belonging to unknown persons. There was no confession, no intercepted communication, no informant. There was only And YOGTZE became an obsession. Investigators, journalists, amateur sleuths, over the years, countless people have tried to decode those 6 letters. The theories are numerous. Let me walk you through the major ones. Theory 1. It's an acronym. Each letter stands for a word. But an acronym for what? No German phrase, organization, or known code system from the period has ever been convincingly matched to YOGTZE. Some have tried to force-fit phrases, but none have gained wide acceptance among investigators or researchers. Theory 2. It's a name, or part of one. Perhaps YOGTZE is a fragment of a person's name, a nickname, or an alias. In German, The combination of letters doesn't correspond to any common name. Some have pointed to Eastern European or Slavic name patterns, but no specific match has been confirmed. Theory 3. It's a license plate number. In West Germany, license plates followed a specific format, a city or district code, followed by letters and numbers. Could YOGTZE, or part of it, represent a plate Günther saw? Some researchers have explored this angle, but no matching plate connected to the case has ever been found. Theory 4. It's connected to his profession. Günther was a food engineer. The letters YOGTZE bear a resemblance to the word Joghurt, the German spelling of yogurt. Could YOGTZE be related to a product name, a chemical compound, a brand, or something Günther encountered in his professional life? This theory has supporters, but no concrete evidence links the letters to a specific product or substance. Theory 5. It's a place name or geographic reference. Some have tried to match the letters to locations, villages, streets, intersections. None have been confirmed. Theory 6. It's meaningless. Perhaps Günther, in a state of agitation or confusion, wrote down something that had significance only in the distorted logic of a troubled mind. Perhaps it was a fragment of a dream, a misheard word, a piece of internal free association that carries no external meaning at all. This last theory is the simplest. It is also the most unsatisfying. Because if YOGTZE means nothing, then the central artifact of this case, the one piece of evidence that Günther himself created, offers no path forward. And the investigation is left with nothing but gaps. At this point in the case, let me ask you something. If you were an investigator assigned to this file in 1984, what would you focus on? The code? The missing hours? The unidentified companions? The pre-crash injuries? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious what stands out to you. Because for the actual investigators, the case was growing cold. The leads were drying up. No suspect was ever formally identified. No arrest was ever made. And slowly, as months turned into years, the YOGTZE case drifted from active investigation into the cold case files, a folder in a cabinet, a name on a list of unsolved deaths. But the questions didn't go away. And the biggest question of all wasn't about a code, or a car crash, or a midnight visit. It was about something much more fundamental. Günther Stoll spent the last period of his life telling people that they were after him, that he was being watched, that he was in danger. Everyone dismissed him. And then he turned up dead, under circumstances that, by any reasonable reading, suggest he did not die alone. Which means the most important question in this case may not be what does YOGTZE mean. It may be, was Günther Stoll right? And that question leads us somewhere deeper, into the psychology of the case, the people involved, and the systems that failed to protect a man who was begging for someone to listen. Psychological breakdown. There is a concept in psychology that's relevant here, and it's worth pausing on. When a person repeatedly claims they are being followed, watched, or persecuted, and when no one else can see evidence of that persecution, the standard clinical framework tends to classify those claims as paranoid ideation. It may be a symptom of a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder, a psychotic spectrum condition, or simply extreme stress. And in most cases, that classification is correct. The persecution isn't real. The fear is generated internally. But here is the uncomfortable truth that the YOGTZE case forces us to confront. Sometimes, the persecution is real. Sometimes people are being followed. Sometimes the threat is genuine. And when those people try to tell someone, when they describe what's happening to them, they sound exactly the same as someone experiencing clinical paranoia. There is no easy way to distinguish between the two from the outside. The language is the same. The agitation is the same. The social consequences are the same. People stop listening. People pull away. And the person making the claims becomes increasingly isolated, which, if the threat is real, makes them increasingly vulnerable. Günther Stoll was isolated. He was unemployed. He was struggling. And he was making claims that the people around him could not verify and chose not to believe. Now consider what we know about his last night. He had a sudden revelation. Now I've got it. He wrote something down. He immediately crossed it out, as if recognizing that putting it on paper was dangerous. He left his home. He collapsed at a pub under unexplained circumstances. He visited someone in the middle of the night for reasons no one understands. He was possibly seen with unidentified individuals. And he turned up dead with injuries that suggest violence by another person. Does this sound like the final night of a man whose fears were purely imaginary? Let me be clear about something. I am not making a clinical diagnosis. I'm not saying Günther was or wasn't mentally ill. The available evidence does not allow for that kind of determination, and it's not my place, or anyone's place without proper evaluation, to make it. What I am saying is this. The question of whether Günther's claims were real or delusional is not just a psychiatric question. It is the central investigative question of this entire case. And the answer to it determines everything. If Günther was paranoid and delusional, then his final night can be read as a tragic spiral, a troubled man driving through the dark, making impulsive decisions, possibly suffering a medical crisis, and ultimately dying in a car accident whose odd details are coincidental or explainable by his erratic state. But if Günther was right, if they were real, then his final night reads completely differently. It reads as the night they caught up with him, the revelation that frightened him, the note he crossed out because he realized it was evidence, the collapse at the pub, possibly induced, the midnight meeting, possibly a desperate attempt to warn someone or seek help, the unidentified companions, possibly the very people he had feared, and the crash, not an accident at all, but a staged scene designed to look like one. Two completely different narratives. Same set of facts. And the investigation was never able to determine which one was true. This is the reframing insight I want to leave you with in this section. The YOGTZE case is not just an unsolved crime. It is a case study in what happens when a person's warnings are filtered through the assumption that they are unreliable. It is a case about the gap between what someone is saying and what others are willing to hear. Consider the investigators themselves for a moment. When police looked into Günther's background and learned that he had been making claims about being persecuted, claims that his wife, his friends, his acquaintances had all dismissed, that information inevitably colored how they processed the evidence. Not because they were negligent, but because that is how human cognition works. Once you learn that a victim was the paranoid guy, a subtle interpretive filter drops into place. The strange details of the case, the midnight visit, the collapse, the note, start to look like symptoms of instability rather than clues to a crime. This is a form of cognitive bias. It's called anchoring. And it affects everyone, including seasoned investigators, especially in cases where the evidence is ambiguous and a simple explanation is available. The simple explanation for Günther's death was, a troubled man had a bad night, made erratic choices, got into an accident, and died. It's clean. It's sad. And it doesn't require anyone to explain who they were. The complicated explanation, that Günther was targeted, attacked, and killed, requires answers to questions that nobody had answers to. Poor they. What did Günther know? What does YOGTZE mean? Why were there no witnesses? Why did no one come forward? In the absence of those answers, the simple explanation held. Not officially, the case was never formally closed as an accident, but practically. The investigation stalled. Resources shifted. And Günther Stoll became a footnote, an oddity, a curiosity, the YOGTZE guy. Over the years, the case attracted periodic attention from journalists, true crime researchers, and online communities, especially as the internet made it easier to share and analyze cold cases across borders. The story appeared in German media, in documentary segments, in web forums, and eventually in international true crime circles. And the way the case was framed in the media tells its own story. Early coverage tended to treat it as a bizarre mystery, the kind of unexplained case that makes for a good late-night TV segment. The emphasis was on the weirdness, the code, the naked man, the passenger seat. Günther himself, his humanity, his struggles, his fear, often took a back seat to the spectacle of the puzzle. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in true crime media. The victim becomes subordinate to the mystery. Their life before the crime is compressed into a few sentences so we can get to the good part, the strange details, the cryptic clues, the unsolved puzzle. And in that process, something essential is lost. The understanding that this was a person who was afraid, a person who asked for help, and a person who didn't get it. It's also worth examining the broader context of Cold War West Germany and what it might mean for this case, not to speculate wildly, but to acknowledge a reality of the time. West Germany in 1984 was one of the most heavily surveilled countries in Western Europe. The Domestic Intelligence Service, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, or Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, monitored perceived threats from both the far left and the far right. The Foreign Intelligence Service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, operated in the shadows of the Cold War's espionage landscape. And East Germany's notorious Stasi, the Ministry for State Security, had thousands of informants operating inside West Germany, embedded in communities, workplaces, and institutions. Is it possible that Günther Stoll, a seemingly ordinary food engineer in a small Westphalian town, had some connection, however tangential, to this world of intelligence and surveillance? Could his claims about being watched have had a basis in the real activities of intelligence agencies or criminal networks operating in the region? There is no confirmed evidence linking Günther to espionage, intelligence work, or organized crime. And I want to emphasize that clearly. This is speculation, the kind that inevitably arises when a case has too many strange details and too few explanations. But it is speculation rooted in the documented reality that, in 1984 West Germany, people really were being watched. Networks really did operate in the shadows. And ordinary people really did sometimes get pulled into situations they never sought out and couldn't escape. Whether Günther was one of those people, we don't know. What we do know is that his fear was not taken seriously. And that by the time someone might have had reason to take it seriously, it was too late. And now, with no trial to recount, no verdict to deliver, and no confession to analyze, we arrive at the hardest part of any unsolved case. The part where we have to sit with what we don't know. And decide what it means. Resolution and aftermath. The YOGTZE case has never been solved. No suspect has ever been publicly identified. No arrest has ever been made. No trial has ever been held. Günther Stoll's death remains officially unexplained, classified in the gray space between accident, suspicious death, and possible homicide. Over the decades, the case has been revisited multiple times, by investigators, by journalists, by researchers. In the age of the internet, it has become one of Germany's most discussed cold cases, drawing attention from true crime communities around the world. Online forums have generated thousands of pages of analysis, theory, and debate. Amateur cryptographers have devoted years to attempting to decode YOGTZE. Independent investigators have tried to trace Günther's movements, identify the potential companions, and re-examine the physical evidence. None of these efforts have produced a definitive answer. Let me lay out the leading theories as they stand today, fairly and without endorsing any one of them. Theory 1. Accidental death complicated by pre-existing injuries. This theory holds that Günther's death was primarily the result of a car crash, and that the pre-crash injuries, the bumper pattern impact marks on his legs, may have occurred in a separate incident earlier that evening. Perhaps he was struck by a car while wandering near the roadway in a disoriented state. Perhaps he stumbled into traffic. This theory treats the other anomalies, the passenger seat, the undressing, as consequences of his confusion or of being moved by the force of the crash. The problem with this theory is that it requires a series of coincidences that strain credibility. It doesn't explain who was driving the car when it crashed, if Günther was in the passenger seat. And it doesn't account for the unidentified individuals reportedly seen with him. Theory 2, homicide, targeted killing. This theory holds that Günther was murdered, that the people he called they were real, that they caught up with him on the night of October 25th, and that his death was staged to look like a car accident. The pre-crash injuries were the result of a deliberate attack. Someone else drove the car into the ditch, either with Günther inside or after placing him there, and then fled the scene. The problem with this theory is the absence of a confirmed motive, a confirmed suspect, or direct forensic evidence of a second person in the vehicle. It is the most dramatic theory, and perhaps the most consistent with the known anomalies, but it rests on inferences rather than proof. Theory 3, involvement in something illicit. This theory suggests that Günther was involved, willingly or unwillingly, in some kind of criminal, political, or clandestine activity. Perhaps drug trafficking. Perhaps small-scale smuggling. Perhaps an intelligence-adjacent operation. His paranoia was actually justified awareness of the dangers surrounding this involvement. His death resulted from a falling out, a double-cross, or an attempt to silence him. The problem with this theory is that no concrete evidence has ever linked Günther to any illegal activity. His background, his employment history, his social circle, none of it, as far as publicly available records show, points to a secret life. This theory requires assuming facts not in evidence. Theory 4. The death was the tragic end of a psychological crisis. This theory takes Günther's reported mental health struggles at face value and interprets the events of his final night as the culmination of a breakdown. The YOGTZE note was a product of disordered thinking. The pub collapse was a panic attack or a dissociative episode. The midnight visit was impulsive and purposeless. The drive through the night was aimless. And the crash, possibly self-inflicted, possibly the result of impaired driving, was the end of a man in crisis. The problem with this theory is the pre-crash injuries. A man driving erratically might crash his car. But a man driving erratically does not typically sustain injuries consistent with being struck by another vehicle while standing outside. That detail resists a purely psychological explanation. Each theory explains some of the evidence. None of them explains all of it. And that is the fundamental frustration of the YOGTZE case. It is a puzzle in which the pieces do not fit together, no matter how you arrange them. What has the case left behind? For Günther Stoll, it left a lifetime of unanswered questions. A husband who walked out the door one night and never came back. A note she watched him write and cross out, 6 letters she has had to live with for decades, knowing they might hold the key to his death but never knowing what they mean. For the investigators, it left a cold case file that represents both a professional challenge and, for some, a personal regret. The sense that something was missed. With better tools, more time, or a different approach, the case might have been cracked. For the broader public, especially the true crime community, the YOGTZE case has become something almost mythical. A case that exists at the intersection of genuine mystery and narrative fascination. The cryptic code. The impossible crime scene. The man who said they were coming, and who may have been right. It is a case that has not changed laws or reformed institutions in the way that some landmark criminal cases do. But it has done something else. It has become a kind of mirror, a case in which people see different things depending on what they believe about the world. If you believe that systems work, that most deaths have simple explanations, and that paranoia is usually just paranoia, you read this case one way. If you believe that powerful forces sometimes operate in the shadows, that inconvenient people are sometimes silenced, and that the truth is not always what authorities say it is, you read it another way. The case doesn't tell you which reading is correct. It just asks you to choose. And that may be the most unsettling thing about it. In the years since Günther Stoll's death, advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, digital forensics, toxicological screening methods, have made it possible to solve cases that were once considered hopeless. Cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s have been reopened and resolved using tools that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. Could the YOGTZE case benefit from this kind of re-examination? Potentially. If physical evidence from the car, from Günther's clothing, or from the crash scene was preserved, and if modern forensic techniques were applied, new information might emerge. Whether that information would be enough to resolve the case is another question. But even if the forensic evidence is gone, degraded, lost, or discarded in the decades since, the case still has one thing that no amount of time can erase. 6 letters. Written in a moment of urgency. Crossed out in a moment of fear. YOGTZE. Günther Stoll knew what it meant. He knew it so clearly that he jumped out of his chair and said, "Now I've got it." He knew it well enough to write it down. And he knew it well enough to be afraid of what writing it down might mean. He took that knowledge with him when he died. And until someone else figures it out, if they ever do, the YOGTZE case will remain what it has been for 40 years, an open question in a closed file. A dead man's riddle written in 6 letters that the world has never been able to read. The road near Hagerseelbach still carries traffic. The A45 still runs through the dark hills of central Germany. The ditch where Günther Stoll was found has long since been repaired and paved over. But the question he left behind hasn't been paved over. It's still there, waiting. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not what YOGTZE means, but whether any of us would have listened if he had told us. Thank you for watching Enter the Crime. If this case stays with you, and I think it will, leave a comment with your theory. What do you think YOGTZE means? And do you think Günther Stoll was right about them? If you want more stories like this, global true crime, told like a documentary, subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll be back soon with another case you won't forget.